The hydraulic press screamed, a high-pitched mechanical whine that meant 3 tons of pressure were about to fail spectacularly. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed the release valve lever, my heavy leather gloves gripping the cold steel, and yanked it downward with every ounce of leverage I had in my shoulders. The pressure gauge snapped back to 0 instantly. The massive steel plate we were bending groaned in protest, settling onto the safety chocks with a deafening metallic thud that shook the concrete floor of the foundry. Dust drifted down from the corrugated rafters, catching in the sharp beams of the overhead halogens. $50 says you didn't check the hydraulic fluid before starting the sequence, I said, my voice cutting through the ringing silence left in the wake of the machine shutting down. Hank, my 19-year-old apprentice, stood frozen a few feet away. He stared at the massive jaws of the press, then looked down at his scuffed steel-toed boots. He wiped a smudge of carbon soot from his cheek, only managing to smear it further across his jawline. I checked the reservoir yesterday, Jayson. Yesterday's math doesn't build today's bridges, Hank, I said, stepping away from the control panel. I pulled off my right glove and wiped a line of sweat from my forehead. The ambient temperature in the shop was hovering around 90 degrees, entirely due to the active forge firing in the far corner. You want to run the heavy fabrication machinery, you check the pressure lines every single morning. That's a bet you can't afford to lose. One blown seal, and that plate snaps back. We don't take shortcuts with the iron. Before Hank could formulate a defense, the heavy metal door leading from the administrative wing clanked open. The hinges needed a shot of grease, but I usually left them dry because the harsh, metallic scraping sound served as a perfect early warning system. I looked up and saw Lyla Rogers step onto the shop floor. She owned the place on paper, at least, and I could tell from the rigid, geometric line of her shoulders that something had gone completely wrong. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, her practical, low-heeled boots clicking a rapid, sharp rhythm against the concrete as she navigated around the stray steel shavings and heavy workbenches. She held a manila folder in her left hand, and her knuckles were entirely white where she gripped the cardboard. "Jayson," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the low, constant hum of the ventilation fans. "My office. Right now." I tossed my heavy leather gloves onto the steel grate of the workbench. I reached into my canvas jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. A browser tab was still open to an online classic car auction. My fully restored 1969 Mustang Mach 1, the car I had spent 4 years rebuilding from the frame up, was listed there. I stared at the current bid for a fraction of a second, feeling the heavy reality of capital and raw steel prices pressing down on me before hitting the lock button and sliding the phone away. "I'll give you 10-to-1 odds that folder contains bad news from the city zoning board," I said, walking to meet her at the base of the stairs. She didn't smile. She didn't engage with the dry wit she usually tolerated. She just turned on her heel and walked back toward the glass-walled office that overlooked the massive foundry. I followed her up the steel staircase, the heavy grate ringing under the soles of my boots. Inside her office, the air conditioning hit my sweat-dampened work shirt like a wall of ice. She threw the folder onto her large drafting table. It slid over a beautiful, hand-drawn set of blueprints for a modern steel and glass conservatory we were scheduled to build next quarter. "Inspector Hill just issued a preliminary notice of closure," Lyla said, resting her palms heavily on the edge of the desk. A slight tremor shook her right hand, but she quickly flattened her fingers against the polished wood to stop it, her jaw tight. "He's citing us for a dozen obsolete safety codes that haven't been enforced in this industrial district since the 90s, and he's using the grandfather clause in the property deed against me." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. Dalton Hill is a bureaucrat with a commercial developer's hand deep in his pocket. He wants this entire lot for the new high-rise project. We knew he was going to push the zoning limits. He's not just pushing, Jayson. He found a legal loophole. She tapped the manila folder with a manicured fingernail. "The original deed to this foundry stipulates that the grandfathered industrial permit, the only thing legally allowing us to operate heavy forging equipment in this zip code, requires the property to be held by a family partnership. My grandfather set it up that way. Since my dad passed, and I'm the sole owner on paper, Hill claims the permit is invalid." I stared at the thick legal jargon printed on the top sheet of the folder, then at the conservatory prints beneath it. My thumb tapped once against my bicep as the parameters of the problem locked into place. "So we transferred 20% of the company's shares to Fiona in engineering. Make it a documented partnership." "I tried that," Lyla said, her tone flattening out into a hard, defensive line. "Hill's office blocked it this morning. He says the archaic language in the city records specifies a matrimonial or bloodline partnership. It was a defensive clause written 100 years ago to keep the business strictly in the family. Now Hill is weaponizing it to force a sale. He gave me 8 weeks. If I can't prove a qualifying partnership by the final council vote, he revokes the industrial permit permanently and the shop gets shut down. I looked out the glass wall of the office, staring down at the massive, century-old brick walls of the Foundry. Lyla had built this firm into the premier architectural ironworks in the state. Seeing her cornered by a paperwork technicality felt exactly like watching someone take a crowbar to a perfectly tuned engine. "So, what's the play?" I asked, pushing off the doorframe and taking a step into the room. "You want me to weld his car doors shut? Because I can do that. I'll lay down a clean bead too. He'd never get them open." Lyla finally looked up, her expression dead serious. She reached into her top drawer and pulled out a different document, sliding it across the drafting table toward me. "First, I am terminating your hourly employment contract," she said, her voice dropping into her rapid-fire boardroom cadence. "As of this exact moment, you are an independent partner and lead contractor. You retain full, unrestricted access to the specialized forge, and you take a clean, flat percentage of the conservatory project profits. That happens whether you agree to my next proposal or not. Your livelihood is safe. You have my word on that." I picked up the paper. It was a standard independent contractor agreement, already signed at the bottom in her sharp, elegant handwriting. I set it back down on the blueprints. "All right. And the second part? I need a legal husband on the deed to Block Hill," she said, holding my gaze without flinching, though her posture remained rigidly tight. "A fully documented, legally binding marriage of convenience. We file the municipal paperwork, we invoke the grandfather clause, we force Hill to recertify the permit on a permanent basis. Once the zoning is locked and completely immune to further legal challenges, we file for an amicable divorce. You can say no. Your job and contract stay exactly the same either way. I'm not asking you to do this for a paycheck, Jayson. I'm asking you to stand next to me as a partner to shield this foundry." The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a trip hammer echoing from the neighboring sector down the street. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the drafting table, leaning in until I was at eye level with her. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer exhaustion she was trying to hide behind tailored wool and fierce competence. "I'll take the alliance," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady. "But if we do this, we do it my way. No hiding behind desks in the office. We face Hill together. Every inspection, every meeting, I'm in the room. If my name goes on that deed, I protect this shop." She studied my face, her eyes searching mine for hesitation or an ulterior motive. "You're sure? Hill thinks he can bully you out of your own legacy using red tape," I said, feeling that familiar, competitive spike lock firmly into place in my chest. "I bet him my reputation that he can't." "Hand me a pen." Lyla exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to deflate some of the rigid armor she wore. She reached into the cup on her desk, pulled a heavy steel fountain pen free, and handed it to me. The metal was cool against my calloused fingers. I flipped to the back page of the municipal marriage registry form she had printed out and signed my name. "First order of business," I said, capping the pen and setting it down with a soft click. "Hill is sending an auditor tomorrow morning to check the ventilation compliance." I saw the notice on the dispatch board. "We need to recalibrate the primary exhaust fan by 6 a.m. I have Fiona running the airflow math on that right now," Lyla said, instantly shifting back into her element, pulling a fresh notepad toward her. "Fiona's math is good," I replied, turning and heading for the door. "But my wrenches are better. I'll see you tomorrow." The next morning, the foundry was freezing. The massive industrial gas heaters hadn't kicked on yet, and the sharp autumn chill had seeped deeply through the century-old brick walls. I was up on the catwalk, 30 feet above the main floor, a heavy torque wrench gripped in my hand. The primary exhaust fan was a massive, industrial turbine designed to pull the toxic fumes from the welding stations and the main forge up and out through the roof. Inspector Hill had cited a theoretical vibration irregularity in the housing unit, a classic, textbook bureaucratic reach. It wasn't broken, but it wasn't perfectly calibrated to the newly updated noise reduction metrics the city had quietly passed last month. I had been up on the grating since 4 in the morning, tightening the heavy housing bolts and manually adjusting the custom rubber dampeners. My shoulders ached with a dull, persistent burn, and my knuckles were scraped raw from the tight clearance around the fan blades. But the turbine was running completely silent. "You're going to drop a wrench on my head, Ross." I looked down over the yellow safety rail. Lyla stood on the concrete floor below, holding 2 large paper cups of coffee from the diner down the street. She wore a heavy, dark wool coat over her work clothes, looking up at me through the geometric shadows cast by the catwalk grating. "I haven't dropped a tool since I was 19, Lyla," I called down, hooking the torque wrench securely onto my reinforced belt loop. $10? Says you brought me the dark roast? "I brought you the dark roast because you've been up here for 3 solid hours and you look like you need it," she said, walking toward the base of the metal staircase. I climbed down the steel ladder, my boots hitting the grated landing just as she reached the top of the stairs. She handed me a cup. The intense heat of the cardboard bled right through the thick leather of my work gloves, chasing the chill out of my fingers. "Thanks," I said, prying the plastic lid off and taking a sip. It was black, bitter, and exactly what I needed. "Hill's proxy is here," she said, her tone dropping the casual banter instantly. "Auditor Vance. He's down in the receiving bay. He wants the ventilation maintenance logs." "Vance is a lapdog," I said, leaning against the safety rail and taking another slow drink of the coffee. "Hill sent him down here to find an easy, technical violation so they can issue a stop work order before we even file the marriage certificate. We file at noon, right? 1 o'clock? At the county clerk's office?" Lyla corrected, her fingers tightening slightly around her own cup. "Let's go say hello," I told her. We walked down to the main floor together, our steps echoing in the large space. He looked incredibly out of place amid the massive iron anvils, the towering racks of raw steel stock, and the heavy machinery. "Miss Rogers," Vance said as we approached. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on her, carrying a specific brand of bureaucratic arrogance that always made the muscles in my jaw tighten. "I'm here to enforce the preliminary notice. Turn the exhaust system on. We have reason to believe the decibel output exceeds the commercial limit for this zone." I didn't say a word. I handed my coffee to Lyla, walked straight over to the main breaker panel on the brick wall, and threw the heavy industrial switch. The primary exhaust fan powered up. Normally, moving thousands of cubic feet of air per minute sounded like a commercial jet engine warming up on a tarmac. Today, thanks to 4 hours of microscopic calibration and 3 custom fabricated dampeners I had machined before dawn, it merely hummed, a low, smooth, perfectly balanced vibration that barely rattled the surrounding sheet metal. Vance stared down at his digital decibel meter. The glowing green numbers held steady, well below the legal threshold. He tapped the side of the plastic device with his index finger, clearly assuming the microphone was broken. "Something wrong with your equipment, Vance?" I asked, walking back over to stand directly beside Lyla. I took my coffee back from her, keeping my hands loose and occupied, my posture relaxed but completely solid. Vance finally looked away from the screen and looked at me. "Who are you?" "Jayson Ross, lead fabricator, and legal partner in this facility," I said. The words tasted strange on my tongue, but I delivered them with absolute, unwavering certainty. Vance frowned, looking quickly back at Lyla. "Partner? The deed records are registered solely to the Rogers Family Trust, which is exactly why Jayson and I are filing our marriage certificate at the county clerk's office this afternoon," Lyla said. She didn't look at me for reassurance. She stared Vance down with the sheer authority of a woman who built empires out of iron. "The partnership meets the exact criteria of the grandfather clause. You can take that back to Inspector Hill." Vance's face tightened, a muscle jumping near his jaw. He looked at the quiet exhaust fan, then at the decibel meter, and finally back at us. "A marriage of convenience won't stop a structural audit," he warned, his voice thin and sharp. "Hill knows exactly what you're doing. This building is 100 years old. I guarantee you have load-bearing faults. I'll be back for a full structural load test. Bring a hard hat," I told him, taking another sip of the dark roast. "And a better decibel meter." Vance turned sharply and walked out of the loading bay, his cheap shoes clicking against the concrete until he reached his sedan. Lyla let out a breath she had clearly been holding for the last 5 minutes. She rubbed her right temple, a small, recurring gesture of fatigue that I was starting to recognize. "You recalibrated the entire turbine," she said, looking back up at the high catwalk. "I told you," I said, tapping the cardboard cup against my palm. "My wrenches are better than his clipboard." The county clerk's office smelled strongly of lemon floor wax and old, dusty paper. We stood together at counter number 4, handing over the notarized documents, our state IDs, and the required filing fee. I wore my cleanest pair of dark denim jeans and a heavy canvas jacket. Lyla was in her usual tailored armor. We looked like we belonged on two completely different planets. I saw the clerk behind the thick glass partition looking back and forth between us, her eyes narrowing slightly as she ran some quiet, judgmental math in her head about the blue-collar guy and the CEO. I felt a sudden, sharp instinct to shield Lyla from that specific look. I shifted my stance, stepping half a pace closer to the counter, physically blocking the clerk's line of sight to Lyla with my shoulder. "Sign here, please," the clerk said, her tone dry as she slid the heavy registry book under the gap in the glass partition. Lyla signed first, her signature sharp and decisive. She slid the heavy book toward me. I took the cheap plastic pen provided by the county and signed my name next to hers. My handwriting was blocky, all capital letters, a habit born from years of writing precise dimensions on raw steel plates with a soapstone marker. "Congratulations," the clerk said, stamping the page with a heavy mechanical clunk that echoed in the quiet lobby. "You're legally married." We walked out of the municipal building and out into the crisp autumn air. The leaves scattered on the sidewalk were brittle and yellow, crunching under our boots. "It feels anticlimactic," Lyla said as we walked toward the parking lot. "You were expecting a parade with confetti?" I asked, keeping pace with her. "I was expecting to feel a massive wave of relief," she admitted, stopping near the driver's side of her sleek black sedan. Her hand rested on the door handle, but she didn't pull it. But Vance was right. Hill isn't going to stop at the permit. He's going to order a structural load test. The main truss system over the forge has been carrying extreme thermal stress for 8 decades. If Hill brings in an independent engineering firm to test the load capacity and we fail, we aren't going to fail, I said flatly. "You haven't run the shear stress math on those trusses," she countered, her voice edging into that high-powered CEO in a crisis tone. "I don't need to run the math on a computer, Lyla. I know the steel." I stopped leaning against the car and stood straight, looking directly at her. "I'll reinforce the primary load joints. I'll weld half-inch sister plates onto the main beams. I'll do whatever it takes to pass the test. You handle the board of directors. I will handle the iron." She looked at me, her eyes searching my face for a crack of false bravado. She didn't find one. Over the next few days, we fell into a tight, defensive rhythm. Late Thursday night, the foundry was completely dark except for the harsh, blue-white glare of my TIG welder. I was up on the scissor lift, fusing a massive steel sister plate to the central roof truss. I killed the arc, the bright light vanishing, and flipped my heavy welding hood up. Below me, Lyla sat at a portable drafting table we had dragged out of the office, reviewing supply chain invoices under the yellow glow of a single desk lamp. We had shared a quiet dinner of takeout noodles an hour ago, eating in comfortable silence over the steel workbench. Suddenly, the heavy corrugated metal of the loading dock door rattled violently. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, sharp sound of someone trying to pry the exterior latch. I set my torch down quietly on the lift platform. I hit the button to lower the scissor lift, the electric motor whining softly in the massive, echo-filled space. Lyla looked up from her paperwork, instantly alert, her pen freezing on the page. I held up a hand, signaling her to stay put. I walked silently across the concrete floor, grabbing a heavy, black Maglite flashlight from the top drawer of my toolbox. I slipped through the side pedestrian door that led to the narrow alleyway behind the building. Auditor Vance was standing by the loading dock, holding a digital camera with a heavy flash attachment in one hand, trying to wedge a steel pry bar under the secondary ventilation grate with the other. I hit the button on the Maglite, shining the blinding, focused beam directly into his face. Vance jumped violently, dropping his pry bar with a loud clatter against the asphalt. Under the municipal safety code, unauthorized access to an active industrial site is criminal trespass, I said, my voice cutting through the cold alley air like a blade. "I suggest you pick up that pry bar and walk away right now before I call the police." Vance shielded his eyes with his forearm, his face pale and sweating in the harsh light. "I'm conducting a visual perimeter check for the city. You're trespassing," I corrected, stepping closer until the beam of the flashlight illuminated the rapid pulse in his neck. "And if I catch you near my forge again, without a hard hat, an appointment, and a warrant, I won't just quote the trespass laws at you. Get out." Vance didn't argue. He scrambled backward, leaving the pry bar on the ground, practically running to his sedan parked down the street. He sped away without turning his headlights on until he reached the intersection. I picked up his pry bar, walked back inside, and locked the heavy deadbolt, throwing the secondary chain for good measure. Lyla was standing by the workbench, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her eyes wide in the dim light. He was trying to get photos of the unpermitted welding, I said, setting the flashlight and the captured pry bar down on the table. We bought some time, but Hill is getting desperate. He knows the marriage certificate blocked his first angle. Lyla looked at the locked door, then up at the heavy steel plates I had already secured to the massive trusses overhead. The rigid tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Her posture softening. "I've never had anyone stand between me and a threat before," she said quietly. I didn't offer a philosophical speech about protection. I picked up my heavy leather welding gloves. "I told you I'd protect the iron. That includes the doors. Now, let me finish this weld." The real test came 3 days later, just as the morning shift was starting. I was using an angle grinder to put a clean, beveled edge on a steel I-beam when the main bay doors rolled open with a loud mechanical grinding sound. Dalton Hill walked onto the shop floor, flanked by 2 men wearing hard hats and holding thick clipboards. Lyla walked out of her office immediately, meeting him halfway across the floor. I dropped my grinder, ignoring the shower of sparks dying on the concrete, and walked over, placing myself slightly behind her right shoulder. Not leading the conversation, but establishing a solid, physical wall behind her. "Councilman Hill," Lyla said, her voice freezing the air between them. "You didn't schedule a site visit with my office." "I don't need to, Miss Rogers," Hill said, a patronizing, overly confident smile settling on his face. "I'm executing a public safety override. Your little stunt at the courthouse was clever, but I'm initiating an immediate, unannounced load test on the primary roof trusses." Today, my jaw tightened. "The legal notice period for a structural load test is 14 days, Hill." Hill looked at me with obvious, unfiltered disdain. "Public safety override, Mr. Ross. If you refuse the test right now, I red tag the building immediately, and you lose the operating license by default." They were forcing our hand. I looked up at the massive steel trusses above us. I had reinforced 3 of them. There were still 2 left on the far side of the shop that hadn't received the sister plates yet. Lyla turned her head slightly, looking at me out of the corner of her eye. I saw the absolute, terrifying panic there. The void opening up beneath her feet. If they tested the unreinforced truss, the building would be condemned on the spot. I stepped forward. "Run the test," I said, my voice carrying the hard, flat certainty of a hammer striking an anvil. Lyla flinched slightly. "Jayson," I said, "run it," I repeated, looking directly at Hill. "But we picked the truss." Hill laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "That's not how an audit works, son. We picked the stress point." "No," I countered. "Under the city's emergency audit rules, if a test is forced without notice, the property owner has the right to request the initial test vector to keep operations safe and maintain business continuity. You want to skip the 14-day notice? Fine. But we picked the beam." Hill narrowed his eyes, his smile vanishing. One of his engineers checked a digital tablet, scrolling rapidly through the city code, then nodded reluctantly at Hill. The loophole was real. "Fine," Hill snapped, his face reddening. "Pick your beam." I pointed straight up at the center truss, the exact one I had finished reinforcing Thursday night. The welds were flawless. The steel was perfectly fused. The engineers moved quickly, setting up their equipment. They attached thick hydraulic tension cables to the central load point of the truss, connecting them to a massive digital strain gauge on the floor. The entire shop went completely silent. Even Hank, who had been organizing tools in the back, stopped moving. Lyla stood right next to me. Her hands were curled into tight fists at her sides. I didn't look at her, but I shifted my stance until my shoulder was just barely brushing hers. A point of physical contact. A grounding wire. I kept my hands shoved deep in my pockets, forcing myself not to reach out and pull her closer, but I let her feel the steady, unmoving weight of my presence. Applying downward force, the lead engineer announced, engaging the heavy hydraulic winch. The thick steel cables went instantly taut. The metal truss 30 feet above us groaned, a deep, resonant sound of immense stress echoing through the foundry. Holding at maximum commercial stress limit, the engineer called out. We stared at the massive steel beam. It didn't bow. It didn't buckle. The welds held the sister plates with absolute, uncompromising strength. The engineer checked his tablet, swiping across the screen. Deflection stayed well within spec. I let out a slow, controlled breath. Hill's face was a dark, mottled red, his jaw clenched tight. "Pack it up," Hill barked at his men, not waiting for them to finish unhooking the cables. He turned his glare onto Lyla. "You won a battle, Miss Rogers. I'll find another code violation. This building is coming down." "You do that, Dalton," Lyla said, her voice returning to its full, commanding power, completely unshaken. "But you'll do it from the sidewalk. Get out of my foundry." When the heavy doors finally rolled closed behind them, Hank let out a loud, echoing whoop of victory from the back of the shop. Lyla turned to me, the adrenaline still clearly racing through her system, her eyes bright. "How did you know about the emergency audit rules?" "I don't like losing," I told her, finally pulling my hands out of my pockets and rolling my shoulders to release the tension. "I promised I'd protect the iron." "Lyla," she looked up at the reinforced truss, then back at me. A small, genuine smile finally broke through the stress. $10 says you're going to make me buy you the expensive dark roast coffee for the rest of the month? Make it 2 months, I countered, the relief washing over me. "And I want a real dinner tonight. Not takeout noodles." Dinner was at a quiet, upscale Italian place downtown. It was neutral territory, far away from the noise, the dust, and the grit of the foundry. I wore my dark suit. It fit well, but the collar felt tight against my neck. Lyla wore a dark green silk dress that caught the ambient light of the restaurant perfectly. We sat in a corner booth. The relief from the afternoon had faded, replaced by a new, heavier tension. "Hill is spreading rumors," Lyla said, tracing the delicate rim of her wine glass with her index finger. "What kind of rumors?" I asked, setting my heavy silver fork down on the linen tablecloth. "He's telling the board of directors that our marriage is a sham, a purchased contract to bypass the law. He's trying to trigger a vote of no confidence to remove me as CEO." She looked down at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. "He's telling them I bought a blue-collar mechanic to save my skin, and that you have no real financial stake in this company." My grip on my heavy linen napkin tightened under the table until my knuckles popped. "Let him talk," I said calmly. "It's not that simple, Jayson," she sighed, her voice tight with genuine worry. "The board is traditional. If they believe him, they'll pull their capital. I'm dragging you into a corporate bloodbath. You should walk away before he ruins your professional reputation in this city. You can take your independent contractor status and build a brilliant career anywhere." She was trying to push me away to protect me. "Lyla, look at me." She stopped tracing the glass and finally lifted her gaze to meet mine. "Hill plays with rumors," I said, leaning forward slightly over the table. "I build things that can hold up a building. Rumors don't carry weight, facts do. I'm not walking away." The next morning, I stood by my workbench before anyone else arrived. The forge was cold, the air in the shop still and quiet. I held my phone to my ear, listening to the hold music from my bank. When the representative finally answered, I didn't hesitate. I stared out the window at the empty parking space by the loading dock where I usually parked my car. "Yes, this is Jayson Ross," I said, my voice steady. "Authorize the wire transfer." The car auction cleared. "Send the full $75,000 to the Rogers Architectural Business account. Label it Conservatory Capital Injection." The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning. The boardroom was a long, glass-walled space on the top floor of the administrative wing. 6 board members sat around a massive mahogany table. Dalton Hill stood at the head of the room, projecting a bright slide showing the original deed requirements on the wall. Lyla sat at the opposite end, her posture perfectly straight, dressed in a sharp navy suit. I stood directly behind her chair, a silent, unmoving presence. I wasn't wearing a suit today. I wore my heavy canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots, and I held a thick, leather-bound ledger in my right hand. "The facts are clear," Hill told the board, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Rogers engaged in a fraudulent, contractual marriage. Mr. Ross is an independent contractor with no equity. He has no legitimate partnership in this firm. Therefore, the grandfather clause is invalid, and you must vote to sell." The oldest board member, Sterling, adjusted his glasses, looking skeptical. "Miss Rogers, is it true that Mr. Ross holds no equity in the foundry?" Lyla opened her mouth to speak, but I stepped forward, placing the heavy leather ledger onto the mahogany table with a loud, authoritative thud that rattled the water glasses. The room went entirely quiet. My name is Jayson Ross, I said, my voice projecting easily across the long table without needing to shout. I am the lead fabricator of this foundry, and as of yesterday morning, I am also the primary capital investor in the new conservatory project. I flipped the ledger open. It was the official, notarized financial log from my personal bank. I liquidated my assets, including a fully restored classic car, and purchased the raw steel stock for the conservatory build outright, I said, sliding the bank receipts and the stamped wire transfer documents across the polished wood toward Sterling. $75,000 of my own money, injected directly into the operating capital of Rogers Architectural Ironworks. My name is on the raw materials. My name is on the marriage certificate. And my name is on the structural reinforcement that passed the city's safety audit 2 days ago. I looked directly at Hill. The smugness had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, rigid shock. I am a vested, financial partner in this firm, I said, my voice dropping to a low, hard baseline. My money, my labor, and my marriage are on the record. If you accuse my partner of fraud again, you won't be dealing with a zoning board. You'll be dealing with my lawyers for corporate slander, and my receipts are better than yours? Sterling picked up the receipts, reviewing the notarized stamps carefully. He looked at Hill, then at Lyla, and finally up at me. He set the papers down and folded his hands. The capital injection is fully documented, Sterling announced, his tone finalizing the matter. The partnership is financially and legally sound. The grandfather clause is unassailable. Councilman Hill, your motion to force a sale is dismissed. Hill grabbed his briefcase. Before he could speak, Lyla stood up. And Councilman, Lyla said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet room, if you ever send an auditor to trespass in my alleyway again or insult my partner's background in this room, I will make sure the mayor hears exactly how you conduct city business. Get out. Hill didn't say a word. He turned and walked out of the boardroom. When the meeting adjourned, we walked back down to the shop floor in silence. The foundry was empty. The crew had gone to lunch. The only sound was the low, steady hiss of the pilot light in the main forge. Lyla stopped near my workbench. She turned to me, her eyes wide, processing what had just happened. You sold your car? She said. It wasn't a question. You spent 4 years restoring that Mustang. It's just metal, Lyla, I said, picking up a heavy steel hammer and setting it back on the tool rack. It can be rebuilt. This foundry can't. You risked everything you had on a bet, she pushed, stepping closer to me. The professional distance completely gone. The fight drained out of my shoulders. My hands stayed clamped on the steel edge of the workbench, not because I needed balance, but because I needed an anchor to keep from reaching out. It wasn't a bet, I said quietly, holding her gaze. A bet means I thought there was a chance I could lose. I didn't gamble, Lyla. I invested. In you. In us. She let out a shaky breath. She didn't say anything else. She stepped forward, closing the space between us, and rested her forehead against the center of my chest. It was a simple, quiet movement, a complete surrender of the heavy load she had been carrying for months. I took my hands off the workbench and wrapped my arms around her shoulders, pulling her into a solid, safe embrace. I rested my chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her perfume mixed with the faint, ambient smell of ozone and hot iron. So, she murmured against my jacket, her voice muffled but steady. We have a 50-year permanent lease, a fully funded conservatory project, and a marriage certificate. Looks like it, I said, my voice a low rumble in my chest. She pulled back just enough to look up at me. The original plan was to file for an amicable divorce once the zoning was locked. I held her gaze, keeping my tone perfectly steady. I'm going to have to pass on that paperwork. I plan on sticking around. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face. 2 weeks later, the final, permanent zoning approval arrived in the mail. It was a heavy, embossed document from the city. We stood together at my workbench. A few yards away, Hank was running the hydraulic press. He checked the fluid reservoir gauge, tapped it twice to confirm the reading, and then smoothly engaged the lever. The machine hummed a steady, safe rhythm, bending a steel plate flawlessly. Looks like he finally learned to check his lines, I noted, watching Hank work. He had a good teacher, Lyla said. She laid the embossed zoning approval on the steel table. Beside it, she placed the independent contractor agreement we had signed in her office weeks ago. She looked at me, her eyes clear and certain. Without a word, She picked up the contractor agreement, tore it cleanly in half, and dropped the pieces into the nearby scrap bin. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a heavy, forged iron key. It was the master key to the Foundry, the one her grandfather had made. She placed it in the center of my palm and closed my fingers over it, right where Hank and the rest of the crew could see. Hank looked over, gave a short, respectful nod, and went back to the press. "We start the new build on Monday," she said, her thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. "Partner." I looked at the key, then up at the woman who had trusted me with her legacy. Behind us, the main forge hissed loudly, a steady rush of fire and heat ready for the next strike. "I'll fire up the forge," I told her. The end. Closing thoughts. I learned that true self-worth isn't about proving you're tougher than the room. It's about knowing your value so completely that you don't need a contract to demand respect. Love isn't about power games. It's about consistency and showing up when the structure is tested. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.